A trusted London policeman turns a corner on a busy street and vanishes. Witnesses see him enter a narrow alley, but he never comes out. Holmes and I find a hidden door, a dark tunnel, and a police helmet left like a warning. A fake constable in a numberless coat is stopping carts with a secret bell signal. The gang is not stealing money, they are stealing court evidence to kill cases. Holmes must catch them in the act, before the truth disappears too. Welcome to the Detective Files, where logic meets mystery and no case stays closed for long. It was a foggy morning in London. The kind of morning when the city seems to breathe slowly, and the cobblestones are damp under your feet. I was in Baker Street, sipping tea with Holmes when the news arrived. Inspector Lestrade himself came rushing in. His coat was wet, his face pale. "Holmes," he said, catching his breath. "We have lost one of our best men. He vanished in broad daylight." Holmes looked up from his newspaper. "Vanished? You mean he is missing from his post?" Lestrade shook his head. "No people saw him. He was walking down a crowded street on duty. He turned a corner and never came out again." The man in question was Constable Alfred Hughes, a steady, honest policeman, known for never leaving his beat. That morning he was patrolling Holborn Street, busy with carts, shopkeepers and workers heading to the factories. Witnesses say he stepped into a narrow lane between two shops. Seconds later, a milk cart passed. When it moved on, Hughes was gone. Holmes put down the paper. "How many witnesses?" "At least 7, Lestrade said. "And they all swear the same thing. He turned into the lane and disappeared." Holmes's eyes lit up in that strange way they do when his mind begins to work. "We shall go there at once, Watson. A man cannot vanish into the air. Something or someone made him vanish." I fetched my coat. Outside, the fog seemed thicker, curling around gas lamps like ghostly fingers. As we followed Lestrade's cab toward Holborn Street, I could not help but wonder, what could make a man disappear in the middle of London, with half a dozen eyes upon him? The answer, I feared, would not be a simple one. Holborn Street was alive with noise when we arrived. Horses clattered by, market sellers shouted about fresh bread and oranges, and a tram bell rang in the distance. Yet, despite the bustle, there was a strange tension in the air, the kind that comes when something unnatural has happened. Lestrade led us to the spot. "This is where Hughes was seen last," he said, pointing to a narrow gap between a tobacconist's shop and a tailor's. The alley was barely wide enough for 2 men to pass shoulder to shoulder. Holmes stood at the entrance and did not step in at once. Instead, he slowly let his eyes travel from the top of the buildings down to the damp stones underfoot. "Watson," he murmured, "note the height of the walls. Almost 30 feet. No windows low enough to climb. And yet—" He paused, crouching to touch the ground. "The cobblestones are scuffed, but only for a few paces. Then they stop." I looked. Indeed, just beyond the first few yards, the damp stones were clean, as though no foot had passed there in days. A young woman selling flowers came over. "I saw him," she said, clutching her basket. "The constable walked in here. Then a milk cart went past. When I looked again, nothing, just like he'd melted away." Quote. Holmes asked her careful questions: what Hughes was wearing, how fast he walked, whether anyone else followed him. She answered clearly, but her story matched the others Lestrade had gathered. We stepped into the alley. The air was cooler here, and a faint smell of oil drifted down from somewhere above. The walls seemed to lean in, making the place feel like a throat swallowing us whole. Halfway down, Holmes stopped again. He knelt, running his hand along a seam between 2 stones. "Interesting," he said softly. "Watson, do you see this?" It was a thin metal line, almost hidden under years of dirt. A hinge, or something like it. Before I could speak, a door in the tobacconist's wall opened suddenly, and a tall man in an apron stepped out. He looked surprised to see us. "Shop's closed," he muttered, and walked quickly away. Holmes's eyes followed him with great interest. "Closed in the middle of the day," he said under his breath. "Lestrade, keep your men watching that man. Do not lose him." And then he added almost to himself, "If Hughes is alive, Watson, he might be closer than we think." The air inside the alley felt colder as Holmes pressed his fingers along the thin metal line again. "This is not part of the original wall," he murmured. It is a later edition. And very well hidden. Lestrade frowned. You mean this wall opens? Holmes gave a small smile, or it did. For someone who knew how. He took a thin blade from his pocket and scraped away the dirt from the seam. The metal beneath was smooth, almost polished from years of use. At one point his blade clicked against something. He pushed, and a small square of stone shifted inward. The wall groaned. Then, slowly, a section of it swung out like a secret door. Behind it, a narrow, unlit passage stretched into darkness. Lestrade's eyes widened. Well, I'll be. Holmes cut him off. Not yet, Inspector. We don't know where it leads, or who might be waiting. We stepped inside, and the sound of the busy street faded behind us. The walls here were damp brick, the floor packed with old dirt. Our footsteps echoed strangely. About 20 feet in, Holmes stopped again. A lantern hung on the wall, still warm to the touch. Recently used, he said quietly. Then we heard it. A faint scuff of a boot ahead. Lestrade tensed, but Holmes raised a hand. We moved slowly forward until the passage turned sharply left. What we saw beyond made my skin prickle. The tunnel opened into a small chamber. A wooden chair stood in the middle. A rope coiled on the floor beside it. A police helmet, Hughes's helmet, lay on the chair. There was no sign of Hughes himself, only the echo of our own breathing. Holmes picked up the helmet, turning it over in his hands. Watson, he said softly, this was placed here on purpose. A message. The question is, for whom? Before I could answer, we heard another sound. The creak of the secret door swinging shut behind us. The sound of the hidden door closing was soft, yet it felt like a thunderclap in that narrow chamber. Lestrade spun around. Someone sealed us in. Holmes moved quickly, lantern in hand, and examined the brickwork where we'd entered. No handle on this side, he said grimly. We are not meant to leave the way we came. The air inside the chamber was heavy, smelling faintly of damp wood and something sharper, like metal dust. Holmes tilted the lantern upward, revealing an old timber ceiling. In one corner, a trickle of water dripped steadily, pattering into a shallow puddle on the floor. Watson, Holmes said, feel that wall. It was cold and slightly vibrating, as though machinery hummed somewhere beyond it. This was built for concealment, but also for quick escape. Holmes continued, our missing man may have been moved deeper in Lestrade's jaw, tightened or taken out another way entirely. Holmes knelt by the rope on the floor. Cut clean, he murmured, no fraying. Whoever tied Hughes was no amateur. He turned the coil over and picked something small from the dirt, a silver cuff button, engraved with the letters H.D. Not Hughes's. Lestrade said his initials are A.H. Precisely, Holmes replied. So our captor leaves us a calling card. From somewhere ahead in the dark, a faint clanging sound echoed, metal against metal, followed by the shuffle of feet. Holmes's eyes met mine. That, Watson, is not the sound of a man running. That is the sound of a man working. Without another word, he took the lantern and stepped toward the tunnel leading deeper underground. The shadows seemed to grow thicker as we followed. Something told me we were walking not just toward the truth, but toward the same fate that had swallowed Constable Hughes. The tunnel narrowed as we moved forward, forcing us into single file. The air smelled of damp earth and hot oil, an unpleasant mix that clung to the throat. The clanging grew louder, steady and deliberate, like a hammer striking metal at a slow rhythm. Holmes held the lantern high. Its light revealed a bend in the passage, and beyond it, a faint yellow glow. Another lamp, further ahead. We turned the corner, and my breath caught. There, half lit in the glow, was Constable Hughes. He was seated on a low stool, his hands bound in front of him. His head was lowered, as though in exhaustion. Hughes! Lestrade called out, stepping forward. The constable jerked upright, startled. His eyes were wide, but not in relief, in fear. He shook his head quickly, glancing toward the shadows behind him. Holmes reacted at once, pulling Lestrade back. Not yet. He whispered. Look from the darkness beyond Hughes. A tall, thin man stepped forward. He wore a black coat, his face pale and sharp. In his hand, he held a short iron bar. His eyes flicked to us, cold and unreadable. Without a word he reached down, gripped Hughes by the collar, and pulled him roughly to his feet. Hughes grunted, but did not struggle. The man then backed away, dragging Hughes toward a side passage. Before disappearing, he said something in a low, clear voice. "You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes." Then they were gone, swallowed by the dark, the sound of their steps fading into silence. Lestrade swore under his breath. "We have to follow." "We will," Holmes said calmly, but I could see the tightness in his jaw, but not blind. "This man knows every turn. We shall take the longer path and meet him ahead." "How do you know there is another path?" I asked. Holmes allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Because, my dear Watson, I saw the draught of air before you did." Holmes turned from the dark passage where Hughes had been taken, and led us back a few paces. He stopped at a spot where the tunnel wall looked no different from any other, until you stood close. Then you could feel it. A faint, cool breeze coming from a thin crack in the mortar. Holmes tapped along the wall with the handle of his knife. A hollow sound answered on the third tap. He pressed firmly on a discolored brick, and a narrow panel swung inward, revealing a cramped side corridor. "This way." He said it should run parallel to the main tunnel. Lestrade eyed the gap. "And if it doesn't?" "Then," Holmes replied, stepping inside, "we hope the man ahead is not the kind who kills quickly." The side passage was tight and uneven underfoot, forcing us to move slowly. Our lantern light bounced off the damp walls, throwing long shadows ahead of us. The air here smelled of coal smoke, suggesting a vent somewhere above. After several minutes, the passage opened into a low arched chamber. Wooden crates were stacked against one wall, and a heavy canvas curtain hung over an opening on the other side. Holmes signaled for silence, then eased the curtain aside, just enough to peer through. His eyes narrowed. "Watson," he whispered, "look there." Through the gap, I saw the thin man in the black coat. He was speaking in a low voice to another figure, short, broad-shouldered, and dressed like a dock worker. Hughes sat on the floor between them, his head bowed, the rope still tight around his wrists. Holmes's gaze swept the chamber, noting every object. His eyes came to rest on a length of chain hanging from a ceiling beam, and a pile of coal sacks just behind it. "We have one chance to catch them both," Holmes murmured Lestrade. "You circle through the far side. Watson, you will stay with me here." At my signal, we strike. I swallowed, and the signal Holmes gave a faint, almost mischievous smile. "You will know it when you hear it." Holmes touched my sleeve and pointed up. The chain on the beam hung over the pile of coal sacks like a heavy tail. He breathed one word. "Ready." He slipped his knife between the chain links and lifted. The metal rasped softly. Then he let the chain fall. The crash was sudden and loud. Coal sacks toppled forward, bursting and throwing black dust into the chamber. The lantern by the kidnappers rocked, then clattered to the floor and went out. "That's the signal," Lestrade shouted from the far passage. His men rushed in. Through the haze I saw the short, powerful man stumble. I lunged and seized him around the waist. He swung a fist, catching my shoulder, but I held on. Holmes was a step ahead of me. He reached Hughes, sliced the rope at the constable's wrists, and pulled him behind the cover of the fallen sacks. The thin man moved like smoke. Even in the dim light from our lantern, he slipped through the dust with a strange grace. His hand found a lever fixed to the wall. There was a clank and a section of floor slid aside, revealing a black shaft with iron rungs. "Stop him!" Lestrade cried. He charged, but the man kicked the lever again. The floor panel snapped back into place between us. By the time we wrenched it open, the pale face was already dropping into the shaft, boots ringing on the rungs. I wrestled my man to the ground. He spat coal dust and curses, but Lestrade's constables were on him in a moment, snapping irons on his wrists. Holmes crouched by Hughes. "Are you hurt?" Hughes shook his head, still breathing hard. "Not hurt, sir. Only weak. They kept me blindfolded. They said they needed my uniform more than they needed me." "Uniform?" I asked. Hughes nodded. "For tonight." "A switch." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A false constable on the street, then?" "For what purpose?" We turned to our prisoner. He glared at us with a stubborn set to his jaw. "Name Lestrade," demanded Horace Dove. He muttered. Holmes looked at me. "HD," he said softly. The letters from the silver cuff button. He reached into the man's coat and drew out a small ring of keys and a brass token, stamped with a bell, and the number 27. "What is this?" Holmes asked. Dove hesitated, then shrugged roots. Times. I haul what I'm told. By whom he stared at the floor. The thin man doesn't give a name. Lestrade leaned in. You'll give it to a judge if you don't give it to us. Holmes lifted the brass token to the lantern. A bell and 27. Watson, what sits near Bell Yard? The law courts, I said, and the money carts that run from the banks at midday. Holmes nodded. A false constable can stop a cart with a raised hand and a shout. He turned back to Hughes. When were you seized? An hour before noon. Hughes answered. They grabbed me at the alley mouth, slammed the hidden door, and tied me. Holmes rose, and I could see the fire in him now. Inspector, we have until noon tomorrow to break this ring. The thin man will replace Hughes on his beat and halt the wrong cart at the right moment. From the pockets of Dove's coat, Holmes produced a scrap of paper. On it a crude map showed Holborn Street and 3 small crosses. Beside the second cross sat a sketched circle with a short line, like a watch hand pointing to 12 midday, Holmes said. And this second mark lies at the corner where our constable vanished. Dove lifted his head. You're too late, he said with a crooked smile. The order changed. It's sooner. How soon? Holmes asked. He shut his mouth, but his eyes flicked, just once, toward the ceiling. Toward the city and daylight above. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Take Dove to the yard and hold him tight. Post a man on the tobacconist's shop. The tall fellow in the apron is part of this. I will take Hughes to Baker Street. He needs rest, and we need his memory. As we led Hughes back through the side passage, I heard the slow drip of water again. It felt to me like the city counting down the seconds. And somewhere above us, a bell would soon ring. Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson fussed over Constable Hughes, as if he were a wounded son. She brought broth and warm bread. Holmes let him eat before asking a single question. That, more than anything, showed me how serious my friend was. When Hughes's hands stopped shaking, Holmes pulled a map of Holborn from the shelf and laid it flat. Tell us in order, he said gently. From the moment you left the yard this morning, Hughes spoke in a low, steady voice. He had walked his usual beat. He had nodded to the flower girl. He had seen the milk cart. He had stepped toward the narrow lane to check a complaint about noise. A hand took my shoulder, he said firm, like a friend. Then a sack came over my head. I was dragged backward through a door I never saw. Voices, Holmes asked too. The thin man spoke clear and calm. The other grunted. They changed my coat for another constable's coat. It had the number patches removed. Holmes exchanged a brief look with me. A uniform without a number lets a thief pass as any man, he said. He turned the brass token over in his fingers. What else, Hughes? Smells? Sounds? Oil and warm metal, Hughes said at once. And a bell. Not church. Smaller. Like the handbell a shop uses. Quote. Holmes tapped the token A bell and the number 27. He placed the token on the map beside Bell Yard. Inspector, some carts stop only by signal. A bell rung twice can mean, halt, to a driver who thinks a constable is waving him down. Lestrade, who had joined us after locking Dove in a cell, folded his arms. So tomorrow, at noon, a false constable will ring his bell and stop a money cart. Holmes shook his head. Dove hinted the time changed. We must not wait for noon. We prepare for now. He drew 3 small X marks on the map. The same places we had seen on the scrap from Dove's pocket. Here are the watchers, he said, one by the tobacconist. One near the tram, one at the public pump. They warn the thin man when a cart is near. The shaft we saw below opens to this corner. With a lever, he can appear or vanish in seconds. Lestrade frowned. We'll flood the street with constables. Holmes lifted a hand. Quiet force, not loud. If he smells a trap, he will do nothing, and the gang will try again later. We need him to act today. He turned to Hughes. I will not risk your life lightly. He spoke the words slowly, and I heard a softness in his tone that few people ever hear from him. But if you can stand for 1 hour at your usual post, we can cover you from the shadows. The false constable will keep his distance, waiting for the cart. He will not come close while you are there. Hughes straightened, pride in his tired eyes. I can stand, Sir Holmes's jaw tightened. Then we stand with you. The plan came together quickly. Hughes would take his place by the alley mouth. Lestrade's men would blend with the crowd as porters and buyers. I would sit on a milk cart with a driver who owed Lestrade a favor. Holmes, in a rough cap and coat, would walk the length of the street like any poor clerk on an errand, eyes on the ground, mind on everything. We left at once. The sky had turned the color of tin, fog drifted low, and the gas lamps had begun to glow. The street was busy enough to hide 20 men, if they knew how to stand still. Hughes took his post. The flower girl saw him and touched her chin with a small smile, as if to say, "You are back." Across from me, a tall man in a shop apron pretended to sweep the front step of the tobacconist. He kept sweeping the same patch of stone. His eyes were not on the broom. Holmes sauntered past, hands in pockets, cap down. As he passed the tobacconist, a small bell rang once from inside the shop. Then again. The apron man did not look at the door, but the corner of his mouth moved. From the far end of the street came the dull clatter of iron-rimmed wheels. A heavy cart turned in, pulled by 2 patient horses. It was not a bank cart. It was a court cart, the kind that carried sealed evidence boxes from the law courts to a safe room 2 streets away. Holmes's head lifted a fraction. I felt a chill. The twist was simple and sharp. We had been thinking of money. The thin man wanted proof, a single box perhaps that could save a friend or hang an enemy. The apron man lifted his hand in a slow, bored wave. The lazy motion of a policeman who has done this 1,000 times. A second later, a constable stepped from the fog beyond the cart's horses. His coat was right. His stride was right. Only one thing was wrong. There was no number on his sleeve. Hughes stiffened. The false constable saw him and hesitated. The bell behind the shop rang twice, fast. The trapdoor in the alley scraped open just an inch. Holmes did not look at me, but I saw his shoulder shift. He was ready. Lestrade's men were ready. Hughes lifted his chin. Then the false constable raised his hand to stop the cart. And the driver obeyed. Now, Holmes breathed. And the street, which had been breathing slow and normal, seemed to hold its breath. The court cart halted. Steam rose from the horses. The false constable raised his hand with lazy authority. Holmes drifted to the rear wheel Lestrade. "Not yet," he murmured. "Let him take a single box. We follow it to its owner." "You ask me to allow a theft of crown property." Lestrade hissed a controlled theft. Holmes said quietly, "If we fail, blame me." It cost Holmes to say that. I heard it. Lestrade gave one tight nod. The clerk lifted the canvas. 5 sealed boxes lay inside. Holmes leaned in as if to help, and, with a touch of his handkerchief, pressed a tiny chalk dot on one seal, and tucked a hair-thin loop of wire beneath the twine. "That one," the false constable said, tapping the same box, unaware he chose what Holmes wished him to choose. The apron man brought a leather sling. From the alley mouth, the hidden panel scraped wider. Coal heat and oil breath came out, and with it, the thin man in a numberless police coat. For 1 second his pale eyes met Holmes's. Then he slid back into the dark with the box. The panel closed. "Now, Holmes," said Watson. We took the side passage. In the dust at the first turn, Holmes found the wire snagged on a nail and dragging a faint line. "Left," he whispered. Air moved colder ahead. Water sounded close. The public pump. Iron rungs rose in the wall. We climbed and eased up the grate. The thin man and the apron man stood at the pump trough. A boy held a low dray pony in the lane beyond. The stolen box rested on the pump's stone lip like a waiting pail. Holmes walked out as any man would. "Your number, constable," he called. "You have none." The thin man reached for the box. Holmes reached faster, turning it so the chalk mark faced the light return crown property. He said in a calm, carrying voice. People turned. A space opened. The thin man measured his chances in a blink. He tossed the box to the boy and ran for the mews. I lunged, caught the pony's head, slid, and held on. Our milk cart slid across the lane as planned. The pony reared. The box thumped to the bed. Lestrade's men grabbed the boy. Hughes, brave and steady, met the apron man at the corner, and took him down hard. The thin man did not struggle. He slipped over the pump rail, and vanished, down the very grate we had used, like smoke pulled by a draught. We lifted the box into a cab and drove to the yard. In the evidence room, the clerk cut the seal. Inside lay a thick leather ledger and a packet of letters tied with blue ribbon. Holmes did not touch them. He read only the first line the clerk exposed, then breathed out, "Not money," he said, "a case." And a name. He looked at Lestrade. "Send for the Crown Prosecutor. Guard every door. The man who smiled at me will try again before dusk." "What name?" Lestrade asked. Holmes's mouth tightened. "You will see it by rule in 1 minute. I will tell you only this. The initials are not H.D. Horace Dove was meant to mislead." He turned to me. In the bright room I saw a trace of strain in his eyes. For the sake of the larger net, he had chosen risk in the street. Even Holmes feels the weight of such choices. "Tea, Watson," he said softly. "We may need clear hands and a steady pulse for the next hour." At Scotland Yard, the evidence clerk set the box on a long table. He handled the ledger and the letters as if they were sleeping snakes. Holmes stood with his hands behind his back, watching but not touching. "The Crown Prosecutor is on his way." Lestrade said, "You may look, but do not remove a page." Holmes gave a small nod. "Quite right." He bent only far enough to read the top lines. I saw his mouth tighten. "This is not a gang for coins," he said softly. "This is a gang for cases." The ledger was neat, the ink very dark. Each entry had a date, a short note, and a payment. Beside several entries was a tiny symbol like a bell. At the foot of the page someone had written, "Bell 27 confirms one entry." Holmes said, "Speaks of a witness list moved from Box C to Box E, then lost between court and store." He looked up at Lestrade. "That is not a theft. That is sabotage." The door opened. Mr. Blanchard, the Crown Prosecutor, entered, a square man with careful eyes. He listened, asked 2 questions, then picked up a letter by its corner. "Read only this much aloud," Holmes said, and pointed to a paragraph. He would not read the rest. Even in danger, he kept to a kind code. "We take what we need, and no more." Blanchard read, "E.V. Remove A.H. from the beat at Holborn. A clean uniform is ready. The box we need should be tomorrow, but may be brought forward. Use Bell 27. C.R. Lestrade looked from the letter to Hughes, who had come in under guard and stood straight despite his pale face. "A.H. is you." Lestrade said, "E.V. must be the thin man." Holmes nodded. "Edward Vale. A theatre rigger, if I judge the hand. He writes like a draftsman, neat and tight." Blanchard tapped the 2 initials at the end. "C.R. Charles Redmayne," Holmes said quietly, "Chief Clerk, for Evidence Movement at the Law Courts. He signs only with letters when he dirties his hands." There was a silence. We all understood. A clerk with that power could starve a case without leaving a mark. A witness note misplaced, a chain of custody line broken, a date shifted, so a guilty man walked free. Holmes looked tired for a brief second. It was the look he wears when the law and justice pull in different directions. "We must catch them in the act," he said, "or the letters will be called lies. Redmayne will say they are forgeries, and that Holmes, the meddler, planted them." He glanced at me. "You see, Watson, proof must be alive, not only written." Blanchard shut the ledger. "Very well. What is the act you expect?" Holmes pointed to another note in the ledger. "A second box. Tonight. If noon fails, take box F from room 3 by the pump vent. The pump vent is the iron ladder we used. Vale will climb again, but this time for the evidence we did not let him take." Lestrade straightened. "We will seal the room and wait for him inside." Holmes lifted a hand. "Not with a crowd. 2 men only, hidden, still. Vale knows the sound of boots. He knows the breath of a room. Give him a reason to come." "What reason?" I asked. Holmes turned toward Hughes. "Our honest constable must be seen again at his post. Vale will think the street is safe if the same man stands where he stood at dawn. Meanwhile, Redmayne will press him to finish the work tonight." Hughes stiffened. "I will stand." Holmes's voice softened. "Then we guard you from every window and every roof." He took from his pocket a little coil of the same wire he had used earlier and a bit of chalk. "The wire will sit across the vent lip inside room 3, he said. "When Vale lifts the grill it will pull this bell." He held up a small handbell from the clerk's shelf, "and the sound will tell us which step he sets his weight on. 3 rings means his left foot. 2 means his right. We will know his balance before we move. Lestrade stared. You can read a man from a bell. Holmes gave the faintest smile. A violinist listens for weight, as well as note by dusk. The plan was set. Hughes returned to Holborn, with 2 plain men in the crowd to watch his back. I went with Holmes and Lestrade to the law courts. Room 3 was a long, narrow store with shelves down each side and a high window like a slit in a castle wall. The pump vent opened behind a set of crates near the rear. The air smelled of ink, polish, and cold stone. We doused the lamps and left only one guttering candle by the far wall. Lestrade and I crouched behind a low cabinet. Holmes lay by the vent itself, his ear no more than an inch from the wire he had placed. He put one finger to his lips. Minutes stretched. You may think waiting is easy, dear reader, but the hard part is keeping your mind from running ahead. Every small sound grows large. A mouse can seem a man. At last the wire trembled. A scrape, very soft. The bell on the floor gave a slow, single ding, then 2 quick ones. Holmes breathed the words, not louder than a thought. Left. Then right. He climbs clean. Quote. A thin blade tipped up the vent grill. Fingers like pale spiders eased it aside. A face rose in the dark square. Vale's face. The same sharp bones and cold eyes we had seen below the street. He waited, listening. The candle's weak flame did not waver. He slid one arm through, then a shoulder. Quiet as a cat, he folded himself into the room. He went straight to a shelf marked F, and reached for a box. He did not see the hair-thin wire across the floor. His boot touched it. The bell spoke a short, hard note. Holmes moved like a sprung trap. He caught Vale's wrist and twisted. Lestrade came over the cabinet at the same instant. I took the other arm. The box slid but did not fall. Vale did not shout. He smiled. Good evening, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's voice was calm. Good evening, Mr. Vale. Shall we ring bell 27 together? From the corridor came another sound. Steps, quick and angry. A key scratched at the lock. The door opened. Charles Redmayne filled the gap, red with fury, then white with fear when he saw us. He turned to flee, and met 2 yardmen in plain coats, who had stood outside just for him. For a heartbeat, all of us held still. Holmes with Vale's wrist, Lestrade half-crouched, Redmayne rigid in the doorway like a man caught by lightning. Then the moment broke. Iron snapped. Words were said that I will not repeat. Holmes stood very straight. For a moment I thought I saw a tremor in his hand. Risk is heavy when it is yours. He steadied himself, and his eyes were clear again. Inspector, he said, we have them at the Act. He looked at the candle flame. Now let us be careful with the law, so the law will be careful with us. By the time the prisoners were locked away at Scotland Yard, the fog had thickened into a slow, drifting wall. Street lamps glowed like pale moons. Holmes and I walked back toward Holborn with Hughes, for he insisted on returning to the place where it all began. The alley looked the same, narrow, damp, its cobblestones glistening. But now the hidden panel in the tobacconist's wall stood open, a constable on guard beside it. The man in the apron had confessed enough to link the place to Vale's underground route. Hughes stopped at the entrance and stared into the shadows. Feels smaller than I remember, he said. Holmes nodded. That is because you see it now as it is, only brick and stone. Fear makes the walls taller. Lestrade joined us, a sheaf of signed statements in hand. Vale will face charges for the attempted theft tonight, and for impersonating a constable. Redmayne's trial will be heavier, conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The letters in that box, they name more men. The yard will be busy for months, Holmes only murmured. If they stand trial, I looked at him. You think they might escape? Quote, I think, he said, that men like Redmayne keep friends in places where the law's light does not reach. Some will vanish, some will fight. We can only prepare. Hughes squared his shoulders, and I'll be here. If another man tries to wear my coat, he'll find me in it. Holmes gave him the faintest smile, spoken like a true policeman. We walked a little further down Holborn, the 3 of us. The flower girl was still at her corner. a few wilted blooms left in her basket. She gave Hughes a warm smile. "I told you," she said, "you'd be back." He bought the last of her flowers and handed them to Mrs. Hudson when we reached Baker Street. She put them in a small jug on the mantel, and for a while their faint scent of summer filled the room. Holmes sat by the fire with the ledger on his knee. He read no more than the pages we had seen, then closed it and set it aside. "Watson," he said, "you have seen again how quickly a man may vanish in plain sight. Not by magic, not by curse, but by a door you never saw and a name you never knew." He leaned back, and for a moment the lines of tiredness showed in his face. Then he looked toward the window, where the fog pressed soft and grey against the glass. "The city," he murmured, "is 1,000 doors. Some we open, some we keep shut, and some open themselves." The morning after the arrests, London felt clearer. The fog had lifted from the roofs, and the bells sounded clean in the air. Holmes and I walked to Bow Street for the first hearing. Constable Hughes went with Lestrade, steady on his feet again. Edward Vale stood in the dock with a flat face and watchful eyes. Charles Redmayne kept his chin high, as if pride could cover guilt. The clerk read the charges. The room filled with the scratch of pens and the low coughs of early risers. Redmayne spoke first. "Mistake," he said. "Confusion. Where is the proof that I ordered anything?" Holmes kept his gaze on the magistrate. He did not answer Redmayne. He let the paper speak, the letter with CR, the map with the 3 crosses, the token with the bell and the number 27, the uniform without a number. The magistrate nodded slowly. Vale said nothing at all. He watched Holmes. He watched me. He watched the door and the window and the floor. He was the kind of man who memorizes the ways out of every room. Bail was denied. The court set the trial for a later date. As we left the steps, Lestrade let out a long breath. "It will hold," he said. Holmes did not smile. "It will hold," he answered, "if we stay careful." Quote, "We visited Holborn Street once more. Carpenters had come to seal the underground way. The hidden panel was taken off its hinges. The floor shaft had a new iron plate and 2 stout locks. The tobacconist's shop stood open. The man in the apron, now under guard, kept his eyes on his boots. Holmes knelt by the old seam in the wall and touched the stone with 2 fingers. "A good trick," he said. "Not magic. A plan." He stood and looked at Hughes. "You did your duty, and more. Men like you keep a city alive." Hughes flushed with quiet pride. "I was afraid, sir," he said, "but I stood." "We all were," Holmes answered, and there was a softness in his voice. "Courage is not the lack of fear. It is the choice to stand anyway." Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson had laid tea. Holmes did not drink at once. He stood by the window, the violin in his hand, and watched the street below Watson. He said at last, "Yesterday I let a thief take a step, so we might catch his master. It was the right choice. Still, I feel the weight of it." "You chose for the greater safety," I said. He nodded. "Yes, but the line is thin. We must always look at it. If we stop looking, we lose our way." He played a few soft notes, then set the violin down. We sat at the table, and he asked me to write the account as clearly as I could. He wanted every step to be plain. How watchers stood at 3 marks along Holborn. How a small bell, rung twice, told the false constable when to raise his hand. How the numberless coat let a stranger borrow the trust of a city. How a narrow panel and a floor shaft gave a man 3 doors, where others saw none. How the target was not money but a box that could kill a case without spilling a drop of blood. When people hear vanishing, Holmes said, they think of fog and ghosts, but it is often simple wood and iron. Hinges. Rope. A lever. A name on a paper. A hand on a bell. As I wrote, a small smile came to him for the first time that day. "You will put in your own voice, of course." He said, "They trust you more than they trust me." "I will put the truth," I said. "The truth," he replied, "is the best friend of both trust and law." Evening came. The city lights drew lines of gold in the wet streets. Somewhere, a street singer tried a sad tune and then laughed at his own mistake. The flower girl from Holborn passed our window with an empty basket and a quick step. Life, which had paused to watch a man vanish, began to move again. Holmes poured the tea at last. He took one sip, and then another. The ledger lay closed on the mantel, tied with string. The letters were sealed and marked for the court. A guard waited at the door downstairs. Our work for the moment was done. I thought of the corner where Hughes had turned and disappeared. I thought of the faces that had watched him, the milk cart, the sound of the bell. The thing that had seemed like a ghost had been only a plan made by men. It is a comfort, I think, to know that most monsters are human. They can be found. They can be stopped. Holmes looked at the embers. The city is a machine of many small parts. He said, oil the right ones, and it runs. Rust one, and it grinds. We are not the machine, Watson. We are only men with cloths and oil. He gave the faintest shrug. For tonight, that is enough. Dear listener, if you ever stand at a corner where someone vanished, remember this. Look for the line in the stone, the cut in the rope, the bell in the pocket, the name behind the order. And if fear makes the alley taller, lift your chin and measure again. Streets are just streets, even when the fog is thick. Mrs. Hudson came in to clear the cups. Holmes thanked her, which he always does. I put away my notes and set my pen down. Outside, a cab rattled by and faded into the dark. The case of the vanishing policeman was closed. But London, generous as ever, would soon open another door. When it did, we would be ready. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe. More chilling cases, more brilliant deductions, only on the Detective Files.